All right. So without further ado, let me proceed. So let me start with Maria Melicheva. Maria is a professor of strategy at National War College. She holds a PhD in political science from Purdue University and JD in international law from Moscow National Law Academy. Maria's research and teaching interests include international and Eurasian security, counterterrorism, human rights, democracy promotion in the post-Soviet territory, Russia's foreign security policies, gender insecurity, and crime-terror nexus in Eurasia, obviously all the relevant topics. Maria is also an author of 3 books, Webs of Corruption, Trafficking, Terrorism Nexus in Central Asia by Columbia University Press, with Lawrence Markovits, and Democracy in Central Asia, Competing Perspectives and Alternate Strategies by University Press of Kentucky, along with Counterterrorism Policies in Central Asia. Well, Maria, without further ado, the floor is yours. Can you please provide a brief overview of the current situation response of your country of interest to Donald Trump's policies?
Yes, sure. So thank you, Maria, for your kind of introduction. And I'm going to jump right in. I really want to be cognizant of my time, and I don't want to carve into my peer panelists' time as well. So something interesting indeed happened in February of this year. The Levada Center, which is the main pollster in Russia, found that almost 1/3 of Russians expressed favorable views of the United States. And it may not sound like it's a very impressive figure if looked at in the vacuum, but it did mark quite an increase. It was the highest level of America's favorability in Russians' views since before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And of course, this raises an important question. Is this shift in public opinion simply a fleeting response to Donald Trump's ascent to the post of US president and his overtures to Russia, or it is a sign of something that is bigger, broader, transformative? And so my punchline today of my remarks is that we should not, and we cannot look at Russian public opinion apart from the Kremlin's deliberate, sustained, well-resourced strategy to manipulate, to shape, to form Russians' opinion, at which it has succeeded somewhat, but also faltered in some other aspects. So I'm going to just very, very briefly show you a few visuals, because when I was asked to talk about this topic about public opinion in Russia, I went ahead and I actually looked at whether there is indeed some kind of correspondence between the media ecosphere backed by the Kremlin and the themes, the topics that are happening there, and whether or not that correlate with shifts and changes in Russians' public opinion. And because Telegram is such a potent tool, it's such a potent resource that has shown to influence Russians' opinion about the war in particular, I did manage to work with the major channels of the news media backed by the Kremlin, major Kremlin propagandists, as well as channels that are notorious in influencing Russians' opinion about the war in Ukraine. And so I looked at the totality of what is going on there. I filtered all of those messages just to zero in on what is being said about Trump and the United States, just to get a fuller picture of the themes and topic in the Kremlin-backed discourse. And I found something very, very interesting that I want to very briefly talk about. But I'm going to start with the US presidential campaign as a start, because that presents kind of the benchmark for seeing how and why Russians' opinion evolved. So in the fall of 2024, the Russian discourse about the United States really focused on a handful of foreign policy issues, such as Red Sea crisis, Iran strikes on Israel. But as you can see in this big orange blurb, it was mostly about the situation on the battlefield and on the Kursk. And what does America has to do with that? Well, the Russians were bragging about the destroyed American-made weapons. And of course, in this center, there are lots of news and speculations on the Telegram channels about the outcomes of the US elections. But it is very, very important that Kamala Harris in particular, already at the time, was presented in a highly negative light. So the Russian media zeroed in on her speaking style, her laughter, her, the repeated criticisms of Fox News of Harris and Trump himself, and they framed her as fundamentally hostile to Russian interests. And it was in September that Levada Center found that 30% of Russians already hoped that Trump would win the US election, even though elections were named as the most memorable event of the time by only 1% of the Russians. When asked what were the most memorable events, the majority named situation in the battlefield. Then when we move into the November and December of 2025, we see that the tone of the official discourses present in the Kremlin-backed media sphere, it began to change. Two events began dominating it. First, the Biden administration, as you may remember, allowed Ukraine to use US-made long-range weapons to strike deep into Russia. And in response, Russia launched its own ballistic missiles, hypersonic missile, Oreshnik. And so those two events, the use of long-range weapons in Russia and Russia's response with Oreshnik, were the two top most memorable events as named by Russians in public opinion poll. And also there's much more discussion of the elections and more discussion concerning Trump's desire to meet with Putin and negotiate a ceasefire. If you look at this other picture, January, February, it's a kind of inauguration, post-inauguration space. One thing that becomes very clear is that information space has gotten so much more saturated. It's messier. There are many more topics, many more issues, and the Trump administration also issued lots of executive orders at the time. So Trump executive orders, the potential summit with Putin and hopes for a ceasefire began to dominate informational space. And we know that there's credible evidence that the pro-Kremlin media ecosystem received guidance to portray Trump in favorable light. And at that time, public opinion polls found that 51% of Russians had a favorable opinion of Trump. But then in March, we see another pivot. The narrative of ceasefire became a little bit quieter, and instead, state media shifted its focus on Putin, particularly his high-profile phone call with Trump. And that call, not ceasefire itself, became the most memorable event of the month named by the Russians. And according to some reports, the Kremlin had issued a directive, namely, stop praising Trump and recenter Putin as the key architect of diplomacy. So what does this tell us? On the one hand, we can see that there has been, at least in my opinion, a deliberate and well-reasoned strategy used by Kremlin to shape public opinion, and it has achieved some measurable results. But I think that it has also gotten trapped by its own narrative machine it's created. So remember that for 3 years, the Kremlin-backed propaganda portrayed the United States and Ukraine as the arch nemesis of Russia. Furthermore, in order to be able to persuade the Russians in that, the Kremlin relied on the support of, or it empowered a network of hardline nationalists, ultra-patriots, ex-Wagner mercenaries, veterans, and war correspondents. And they are right here in this top quadrant. Many of them are still associated with the former universe of Prigozhin. And it is now from that part of the media spectrum that we hear a lot of dissent, fierce pushback against any rhetoric that hints at compromise. The so-called de-influencers deride what they call dogovornyak. Dogovornyak, it's a cynical Russian term that implies a shady background deal. Even Putin himself, although he's been very careful at messaging that, he publicly warned of unnamed forces trying to sabotage negotiations, which is kind of a tacit acknowledgement of how powerful these influencers are. And while the numbers that support them are still small, maybe under 20%, they are vocal, they are ideologically rigid, and they're increasingly backed by a growing base of war veterans. So here's a controversial thought for you. One underappreciated reason for why the Kremlin may be hesitant to end the war is this. It has the challenge of managing a politicized, unpredictable, and potentially radicalized post-war veteran and ultra-nationalist class. And I think there is a palatable fear of a repeat of what happened after the end of the Soviet-Afghan war, when neglected veterans became civil activists and nationalists, some of which even dissented the state. And again, wanting to make my punchline as clear as I could, I'm just going to finish on this. So again, we can't really understand Russia's public opinion outside of this broader context of the Kremlin trying to shape it, succeeding but also faltering. And to me, it also represents one of the dilemma that the Kremlin itself and many other authoritarian leaders trying to control informational space face today. They built a very strong narrative, and the stronger the narrative, then it is increasingly harder to rewrite it. Even though 1/3 of Russians favor United States, 2/3 continue holding very unfavorable views of the United States. But the Kremlin's biggest challenge today, again, in my view, is that it has to rein in a very volatile ideological base. That's the base that it empowered because it needed that base to propagate the pro-war narrative. But now it continues advocating for maximalist goals, and the Kremlin has to contend with it. And again, I can talk more about, how, some of those more radical views also find reflections in the broader public opinion. Thank you very much. And I hope I stick to my 8 minutes.
Fascinating, Maria. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions afterwards. But in the meantime, in the interest of time, we move to our next presenter, Vladimir Dubovik, an associate professor of Department of International Relations and director of the Center for International Studies at Odessa Ilya Mechnikov National University in Ukraine. He has also conducted research at the Kennan Institute, made unfortunately rest in peace at this point. We'll see what happens to it. At the Center of the International Security Studies at the Center of Maryland, taught at the University of Washington in Seattle, and St. Edward's University in University of Texas as well. He is the co-author of Ukraine and European security with Macmillan, and has published numerous articles on US-Ukraine relations, regional international security, Ukraine foreign policy, etc., etc. Well, Volodymyr, we're all excited to hear about your take as to how the whole situation is perceived in Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maria. And let me thank also all organizers and those people who initiated this event today. I am proudly associated with Ponors Eurasia since 2002, and it's very good to see that with time, Ponors is still here and it still does events and programming and activities, and that's great because I think it's a unique network of scholars dealing with post-Soviet Eurasia, so to speak, post-communist world, to put it broader, and we need to keep it running, and I hope it will be the case. And also, let me say that, of course, if Trump's coming to power, back to power, to the White House, affected anyone, that's Ukraine, of course, is among those who've been the most affected. Let me say that the background on Trump and his relations to Ukraine has been a negative mostly, for the most part. Like back in 2016, he actually suggested that maybe Crimea should be recognized as a part of Russian Federation, made other statements, which quickly made him least favorite person to win the election, and that's why Ukrainians rallied around Hillary Clinton, who didn't win. But the Trump, of course, remember Ukrainians siding with his arch enemy. And also, of course, Ukrainians torpedoing one of his chiefs of his campaign, Paul Manafort, after submitting some of the documents about his dirty deals in Ukraine when he was advising Yanukovych and others. So fast forward to 2019, when there is another situation there, and Trump is actually talking to Zelensky and asking for some favor, and that exploded in the face of Trump and actually added some negativity about Ukraine, and that led to hearings in the Congress, of course, and impeachment from a lower chamber, House of Representatives. So despite Trump saying it was a perfect conversation. And that, of course, by the way, colored a little bit Ukraine's understanding of what the US is up to, at least Zelensky and Zelensky's team, because the first thing that Zelensky as a young president encounters from the US is this pressure from Trump and the blackmail and the freezing of the assistance, security assistance to Ukraine. So that really taught Zelensky a lesson, I think, and left a trauma, lingering trauma for Zelensky, for not to trust Americans, because Americans might have their own agenda and their own hidden interests, and they not always have Ukraine's interests at heart. And I think we're seeing that playing out again and again, actually, in how Zelensky treats what Americans are doing, what Americans are saying, including actually multiple warnings from the US prior to February 2022 about the incoming imminent Russian aggression that Zelensky has chosen basically to downplay publicly, at least on a number of occasions. So then, of course, Trump has never really understood why Ukraine should be supported. Why would we be on the side of Ukraine in this war? Isn't that more natural for us to, join forces rather with a bigger player here, with Russia? We know that he wanted some kind of a big deal, strategic deal, a bargain, big bargain, grand bargain with Russia when he came to the White House first time. Didn't work out for a number of reasons, including multiple investigations against apparent alleged connection of his campaign to Russia. Anyhow, he was under the microscope, so he didn't move in that direction, but he always wanted it. So he's coming the second time and he wants it again. Some people who defend Trump on Ukraine would say that, well, he was the first one who actually authorized provision of lethal weapons to Ukraine with javelins given in 2018. But that was a very special episode when he was actually replying to the accusations of connections to Russia and sympathies to Putin and Russia. And that's why when the people around him suggested that we should give some lethal weapons to Ukraine, he said, well, okay, yeah, let's do it. Maybe that's going to be a good idea in terms of people stop saying that I'm a pro-Russian politician or something like that. So anyhow, since then, of course, in the last few years before his return to the White House, he's been really active in dismissing the whole assistance to Ukraine, the very idea that the money is being sent for nothing, that it's not providing Ukraine with any benefits, that Ukraine is going to lose the war, doomed to lose the war, and Russia is doomed to win, that money's been stolen or the weapons been stolen or something like that, and there's no adequate control. We know the tune, and he really worked the entire big segment of Republican Party into this, denial of a need to help Ukraine move forward, and he blocked unilaterally, basically, the decision on the last package of assistance to Ukraine, which was passed with a half a year delay in April of last year. So when Ukraine knew about that, and we were trying to prepare for Trump coming back to power, and Zelensky launched this idea, for instance, about the rare earth minerals, except that, of course, no one in Ukraine has expected that this drafts of the treaties would come in such a neo-imperialist, neo-colonialist way, that you should give everything you have to us, and then we'll see. And of course, there is no security guarantees whatsoever attached to it. So the expectations in Ukraine, surprisingly, were quite positive with a lot of people, because people were fed up with this spoon feeding by Biden, and wanted to take a gamble with Trump. And Trump seemed to be an unconventional, unsystemic, disruptive, unpredictable politician. So a lot of people in Ukraine, including people in power, thought that might work better for Ukraine. But of course, it didn't. The whole 24 hours promise that the war will stop in 24 hours. We now know it's not going to happen. And even Trump himself says that, well, that's not happening. It's going to take more time. And now the path so far has been very difficult for Ukraine. Of course, the culmination perhaps was a meeting in the Oval Office in the White House on February 28th, when Ukrainian leader was basically humiliated. I would still insist that it was probably in a kind of an ambush and a setup, even though it happened by the end of the conversation. But anyhow, of course, it damaged relations and the trust. And I think it was already a reflection of people in the White House not being happy with Zelensky, actually not being ready to accept all of American conditions, forced on him, including on this rare earth mineral deal, but also on the bigger issues, like an attempt to talk about security guarantees instead of agreeing to the ceasefire, for instance, because to Ukraine, the core issues are meaningful. That is what happens after the ceasefire. Even if ceasefire is actually happening, is it actually being in check? But how about security guarantees? What about peacekeepers? What about other things that are incremental and very important to Ukraine, critical to Ukraine? So the core issues remain. The Ukraine adjusted. The President Zelensky now mentions Trump strong leadership in every tweet related to this. Ukraine agreed unilaterally, without any conditions, unconditionally, to the ceasefire, to the truce agreement, unlike Russia. But still, we're not seeing any carrots, given our way, except for restoration of military aid, and sharing, intelligence sharing. But there is no stick supplied to Russia. So that's what really troubles people. And today, when Witkoff is in Russia, special envoy who basically, repeats the mantra and the narratives that are typical of Kremlin, really, about the war, and that does not please anyone in Ukraine. And that Russians and American diplomats met, I think, yesterday in Istanbul again on a different track. All of that is really not pleasing us because we're not seeing the way forward for us. Like, what about Ukraine? And not only Ukrainians are not happy, but Europeans are not happy, obviously, because they're seeing belligerent Russia on one hand and kind of unreliable and ignorant Washington on the other hand, and therefore they're blocking with each other and they're blocking with Ukraine. And that's one positive development for Ukraine, that Europe is coming together to some extent and they are coordinating with Ukraine right now. And this would be perhaps a way out for Ukraine, except that, of course, there are some weapons that can only be given to us by United States. So it would be difficult for Europeans to backfill and substitute Americans in that respect. But at least there is some way forward, and Ukraine and Europe have some cards to play. And we'll see if there is a deadline indeed that Trump set for Putin, and what would happen if that deadline passes and Russia is still not, agreeing to the ceasefire. But that remains to be seen quickly in the coming weeks, I suppose. I personally do not believe that Trump wants to actually put any harsh measures against Russia in place, that he believes that his priority is opening this new era in relations with Russia and actually founding this new epoch of strategic partnership with Russia, and everything else is secondary, including Ukraine's interests.
Thank you so much, Vladimir, for this certainly very sobering reality. On the upside, if history is any teacher, we have seen repeatedly strong actors trying to come to Ukraine to subordinate Ukraine, always failing. And I'm sure Ukraine will prove itself strong as always. But let's move on to our next excellent presenter to describe a broader, basically, impact of all this development on the rest of the region. Would love to introduce Emil Zuraev, who is a political scientist and analyst based in Kyrgyzstan. Thank you so much for joining us, Emil. He has taught in the undergraduate and graduate political science programs at the American University of Central Asia and is a visiting senior lecturer at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek. Emil's research and teaching areas include geopolitics, international relations, and security pertaining to Central Asia, issues of democracy, state building, and constitutionalism in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia. Emil also has worked at the Soros Foundation, as well as he's a fellow of the Crossroads Central Asia, a Bishkek-based think tank, and a regular speaker and contributor in local international media on Central Asia and related political themes. Emil, thank you so much for joining again, and the floor is yours. How all this process is reflected in the countries of your interest?
Thank you, Maria. I'm very glad to be joining this panel. Thank you again for having me as well on it. Let me start with this anecdote after a very sobering presentation from Volodymyr about Ukraine's case. In late 2020, Kyrgyzstan had a new leadership come in office as a result of a post-electoral protest, and back then, still to be President Japarov was very much compared to the first President Trump, to the first presidency of Trump, and primarily for the very effective populism with which Trump was already known by then. Fast forward 4 years down the road, I've heard a few people compare it backwards, that the second Trump is very much like President Japarov of Kyrgyzstan, and by extension, perhaps one could also say that about the Central Asian other countries as well. And that is in the way in which Trump 2.0 has been working with his Congress, picks of his cabinet, and just the way in which the government has worked. So this is by way of sort of getting started with how much understanding and how much link there has been between the Central Asian capitals and the United States. And my remarks here primarily concern the state perspective, not so much applicable to all of the society when I talk about these. Now, it may well serve for me to give a 2-minute background to U.S. Central Asian relations in a very quick, generalizing way. Some of our colleagues, even in PONARS, have previously done this. So one could periodize U.S. Central Asian relations and identify up to this point three sort of evolving phases of that relationship. The first phase, post-independence of the Central Asian countries to around 2000, was what you might call this sovereignty and state building and independence support phase by the United States to very young countries, including support for democracy, human rights, and all these other sorts of soft and humanitarian topics. That was very much perhaps the more genuine relationship between these the two sides, very much about Central Asian countries themselves. And yet it was a language which these countries, the elites of these countries did not quite speak well. The language of the rights, the language of rule of law and democracy were things that were somewhat not what they had internalized just yet. But then came the second phase, 2001 through roughly 2015. And that is basically the relationship that was shaped by the war in Afghanistan and Central Asia. And this was a phase where the two sides understood each other very well. It was a time when the top concern and topic of conversation was security cooperation, and including a base in Kyrgyzstan, military basing for a little period in Uzbekistan as well, and generally, prioritizing things that these countries, the governments of these countries, could understand very well, security primarily. But it was not so much about them so much. It was really about Afghanistan and other countries, and the Central Asian countries were more conduits, more instruments for carrying on another agenda. And the third phase is roughly, again, 2015 to 2025. It was post-Afghanistan drawdown of the United States, and it became eventually a very multi-directional geopolitical phase, where it was both somewhat a language that they could understand. It was really about security, but also it was, nudging here and there on human rights, on democracy, again, constant irritants for the countries, for the leadership of the Central Asian countries. And also it was only partly about the Central Asian countries themselves, especially with the strategy for Central Asia that the first Trump administration launched back in 2019, 2020, prioritizing Central Asian security, Central Asian sovereignty and territorial integrity, well before the full-scale war in Ukraine, to note. But still, it was a geopolitics of great powers where Central Asia was one of the elements of fighting that geopolitical rivalry. So the question then brings us to today, 2025 onwards. Are we in witness of a new phase, the evolution of US Central Asian relations to a new phase where something else might happen? And the question that is very much asked in the Central Asian capitals is whether this time it will really be about Central Asian countries themselves that the White House forges its foreign policy, and will it be a language that they share, that they can fully understand? And I think in both counts, so far they have received very encouraging signals. Just to note, of course, Central Asian direction or activity in the US foreign policy has not been very much so far in the last 3 months or so. We cannot really just count the episodes such as the remark by this one senator during the confirmation hearings with Marco Rubio about the need to carry on with the C5+1 format of dialogues with the United States, the importance of rare earth metals and minerals in Central Asia, and generally to open up trade, to drop the Jackson-Vanik limitations, limitations on trade with Central Asia and all. And that. And then more recently, Secretary Rubio had phone calls with Kazakh and Uzbek counterparts of his, and also followed up more recently with a meeting between Rubio and Foreign Minister of Uzbekistan. And just to note, the readouts from the State Department website after the phone calls with the Kazakh and the Uzbek foreign ministers was very trite and almost the same text. It was basically the same thing about how the two sides talked and confirmed each other on cooperation in terms of security, in terms of support for territorial integrity and sovereignty of these countries. So based on all of that, of course, it's very hard to say that there is much substance just yet to be seen. But based on the general rhetoric of the Trump administration so far, the Central Asian countries have been looking out for a more serious, more substantive conversation going forward. And in this way, I think what Central Asian countries are able to expect from White House and how they might want to respond is, one, that there will be probably a continuation of the same platform of C5+1, which was supported during the first administration of Donald Trump, even though it was started by Secretary John Kerry under Obama in 2015. And that will be an important dialogic platform that these countries will be likely to pursue. Central Asian countries themselves probably will be doubling down on their much cited multi-vectoral foreign policy approaches, where United States will remain, and they will want to make it even more significant directions in their multiple vectors of foreign policies. However, and also as they watch United States and Europe have certain tensions and frictions between themselves, and the European Union, having had a summit in Samarkand just last week, the Central Asian countries might be encouraged to note that the so-called collective West is not really a collective anymore, but actually at least two different, or maybe even more actors. So much the better for the multi-vectoral foreign policy for these countries. But one thing that they will certainly worry about and would not want to happen is if the United States continues to make China the paramount and primary direction of its foreign policy, and in that sense, a rival that needs to be contained, and Central Asia somehow comes to be strictly instrumentalized to containing China, then Central Asians, of course, will resist and will find that very unwelcome. To make it very clear, Central Asian countries will in no time foreseeable in the foreseeable future will see the United States as more important or more influential than China. It just is not possible. And should the United States foreign policy pit China and the Central Asian states against each other to cater US foreign policies, then of course that won't be very good for US Central Asian relations. So I think that much can be said at this point, not to take too much time. I think it is a wait out period, and I might just end with this one note that President of Uzbekistan, Mirziyoyev, in his congratulations with the victory of President Trump, also invited President Trump to visit Uzbekistan. Now, that's something that gets cited all the time, that no president of the United States ever visited Central Asia. It's doubtful that President Trump will visit. He hasn't come out of the United States so far, anywhere, as far as I know. Central Asia is unlikely to be the destination this time either. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emil. Maybe if you create good golf courses in there, you can really increase your chances of welcoming US president.
Yes, that we're working on.
Very comprehensive with you. Thank you. And I think it helps us understand the broader picture, the impact of the change in these policies on the dynamic in the region. And of course, I would love to bring into the conversation our last, but certainly not the least, participant, Bedina Lebanidze, who is a senior analyst at the Georgian Institute of Politics and a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Slavic Languages and Caucasus Studies at Friedrich Schiller University, Jena. He obtained his doctorate in political science from the Free University of Berlin, and previously he also held various teaching and research positions at the University of Bremen, the University of Freiburg, Berlin School of Economics and Law, Free University of Berlin, Eurasian, etc., etc. Vidzina, welcome. And perhaps you can also complement our conversation by discussing how South Caucasus are responding to the dramatic changes in the world geopolitics.
Thank you very much, Maria. Also, thanks very much for your invitation to this event. I'm very glad to be here. Okay, I'll start with Georgia, and I will also say a few words about the other countries probably. Now, unlike Ukraine and several other countries in the region, I think Georgia so far has not significantly felt the impact of the Trump administration. And the reason is, and one of the reasons is that the US approach towards Georgia and towards the Caucasus region generally was already quite low-key in some key policy areas. And so that the Trump's more disruptive foreign policies so far had little additional effect. And this is especially evident, for instance, in the area of security. And as you may know, Georgia had been denied security guarantees for a long time by the West, and Georgia's NATO accession was killed in 2008 by Europeans, etc., etc. And to this day, Georgia is very vulnerable towards Russia and exposed to various threats. And consecutive US administrations have kind of also adopted this policy from Obama to Biden, so that now Trump has come to power, and yeah, there are those discussions that he may sell the entire region to Russia and accept Russia's sphere of influence. And yeah, it can always get worse, but so far, from the Georgian perspective, it has been more continuation than change. And the same applies to economy. For instance, the US has never been a key player for Georgia in economic terms. And now Trump imposed 10% of baseline tariffs on the country, but again, it doesn't really matter because Georgia has only been investing. Georgia has invested last year only $8 million, if I'm not mistaken, to the US, so it's almost a non-issue. And it's not even discussed widely in Tbilisi. And the third area, which probably also matters, is a political area, including the democratic reforms, and we have seen those continuing protests now since last November, and we have two points should be highlighted here. The one is of course the ruling party, Georgian Dream, which has been consolidating its political power at the cost of country's democratic future and democratic reforms. And then this goes hand in hand with Georgia kind of turning away from the West and drifting towards illiberal electors, illiberal world. And the second aspect is the weakness of Georgia's political opposition, which makes political change very difficult in the country. And we have been watching now these months-long protests against the government since November of the last year, but this protest lacked political component exactly because of this. So the majority of population is clearly against the government. They are protest voters, but they are not opposition voters. And this is also an important point, something very often overlooked in Western discussions about Georgia. Well, then again, if we think about impact of Trump administration about democratic future of Georgia, well, it's hard to predict because already the previous administration under Biden and together with the European Union, they kind of failed to have any impact on Georgia's democratic problems, on Georgia's authoritarian drift, on polarization in Georgia, and on in many other problems. Well, now if we think about what are the expectations of different actors in Georgia or the Georgian government, Georgian Dream, they are very pragmatic actor. Now they look like they are moving towards Russia. They are very often labeled pro-Russian, but in reality, I think they are more opportunistic political force, and they need close relations with illiberal electors to stay in power. And they would not be against to have a similar deal with Donald Trump, of course, and with a new US administration. If they kind of reach an agreement, geopolitics over values, they would be happy to realign Georgia, to reset. They even stated recently that they are seeking the reset of relations with Russia. And what they mean, of course, is that to get closer geopolitically, but they expect also the US to turn blind eye to democratic shortcomings in the country, and they would be very happy about it. But they are still in the process of waiting because they really don't know how the Trump administration will turn out. There is a lot of uncertainty in the country. And on the other hand, we have the second camp, the political opposition, but also those protesters who have been protesting for a long time. And they are, of course, more pessimistic about Trump administration because of defunding USAID and all kinds of democracy promoting programs, and because of Trump's transactional agenda. They don't expect much, but they also understandably focus more on Congress and Senate than the Trump administration. And they hope that some people in Congress, in US Congress, who sympathize themselves with Georgia would bring up legislative acts. So there is now discussion about this Megobari Act, which would which, if adopted, of course, would make the life of Georgian government much more complicated. But so far, yeah, it needs to be adopted by the Congress and Senate, and it's still a long way to go. But so they hope, the opposition hopes that the Georgian portfolio, so to say, will be dealt by more mid-level bureaucrats in Congress and Senate, and will not be left to the president and to the administration, which I think it's not very realistic, but still. So those are those two basic expectations in Georgia. So the government expects to have some geopolitical deal with Donald Trump. They also consider themselves as ideologically aligned. They subscribe to this kind of social conservative values, and they also fight against the deep state and global world party, and they think that they are ideologically close to Trump administration, and this would make it easier for them to have some pragmatic deal with Trump administration. And the opposition hopes that Congress and Senate would help them somehow to put more pressure on the Georgian government. Now, probably I have 1 minute left, and very briefly about two other countries, so I don't have much time left. But I think Armenia is the same position as Georgia. They have also a lot of skepticism towards the Trump administration. And both, in fact, all three South Caucasus countries, they expect more transactionalism from Trump, and the more authoritarian leaders and more authoritarian forces, they expect and they hope to have some kind of geopolitical deals and more pragmatic relations with Trump, and less focus on democracy. And those who are in favor of democratic processes and getting also closer to the West and away from Russian influence, they are more skeptical, more frightened, but still in the mood of waiting, I would say, because it's not clear for this particular region, the South Caucasus, what Trump will do in the next months and years. Okay, so I will stop here, and I'm happy to.
Thank you very much, Bedina. Very comprehensive too, and certainly our thoughts are with brave people of Georgia, as well as, of course, amazingly courageous people of Ukraine who keep the fight despite the very unfavorable circumstances. So I will just first of all encourage our panelists, our participants, to send questions. I do not see the questions just yet, but I see that we have about 60 participants, which is very impressive. And please do message them in chat so that I had an opportunity to ask these questions to our esteemed presenters. In the meantime, I certainly have a lot of questions myself, and I'm gonna maybe, Maria, ask you one question and and a separate question to the rest of our presenters. I think it will make sense. Maria, question to you. That is coming from me personally, is I'm constantly attacked for actually relying on the Russian polls. Can you please? It's inevitable, dreaded question, but I feel like we have to address the elephant in the room. To what extent do you think we can trust the Russian polls, and also these concerns about the nationalists somehow constraining Putin, I think have been there for quite some time. To what extent do you think this is a little bit of an of exaggerated fear, given that we frankly do not see a lot of activism in any Russian civil groups at all? Historically, it doesn't seem that Putin has faced challenge from any of the groups, or maybe this is different this time, and it is true that he treated the nationalist group separately. This is for you, but before I let you answer, let me also ask the rest of our participants to let them an opportunity to think about the question, as long as I have Maria speak. The broader question, in light of this change in geopolitical dynamic and the US policies vis-a-vis the region, do you feel that Russia that it basically empowers Russia and forces the countries of Eurasia to start bandwagoning, maybe adopt certain balancing strategies vis-a-vis Russia that you haven't seen before, or maybe the situation is much trickier than that? So I'll turn to you later, but first I would love to let Maria answer. Thank you.
Great questions, very, very complex one. And I think the second one is a little bit easier to address. As a scholar, I think that's a great question. We should be very, very circumspect to not exaggerate the extent to what there is any kind of challenge to the Putin's regime, either on the far right or from like traditional liberal civil society. Having said that, I think how many of us, meaning the analysts, were able to predict Prigozhin's mutiny, for example, I think what I agree with your assessment that we shouldn't exaggerate the extent to what ultra-nationalists present a challenge to the Putin regime. But at the same time, if Putin were not concerned, he wouldn't be responding to that challenge in a way that the Kremlin did. So, for example, we know that there was a flurry of arrests. Gherkin, for example, but he's just one of several that the security forces on the premises of extremism put into jail, and they were kind of more vocal critics of the Ministry of Defense and Putin himself. Second, I mean, there is a reason for why the Kremlin moved in to change in policy and now required to de-anonymize all Telegram channels that were previously anonymous, and the threat is that they would not be able to use any funding, so they wouldn't be able to raise money through ads and commercials on the Telegram if they do not register officially with Russia's registry. And again, some of his bits and pieces of replies that I mentioned. So I think Kremlin is concerned, and it shows in the policy in some of the messaging. So he is keeping an eye, and again, so A. And B, if anything, I think I'm just, if we can keep an eye on what is going to happen to Russia with Russia's demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And there's a reason for why, again, the government put in a lot of resources into various programs to take away any opportunity from the veterans to organize in ways that can potentially pose a threat to the regime. So if anything, again, I think we need to keep an eye without over-exaggerating the extent to what imposes a threat, but the Kremlin is keeping an eye, so should we. As for the public opinion polls, I think the answer is the same. We shouldn't rely on public opinion polls exclusively. I think they should be one of a larger piece of data. We should always triangulate what we think we know. But I would fall back on the answers that other researchers of Russia's public opinion, and probably yourself, made. I mean, there have been quite some consistency regarding Russians' public opinion about the war, and a lot of that opinion is consistent with some of the rare online experiments that suggest that there is public opinion, that it responds to certain shifts in the broader media sphere and so on and so forth. So I think we shouldn't completely dismiss this very important and valuable piece of data, but be also very circumspect in how we use and what inferences we draw from that.
Excellent answer. Thank you, Maria. And to add, I can only add that where is that alternative reality that the polls do not describe? I'd love to see it very much, like the major opposition or maybe anti-war movement, perhaps emerging outside of Russia, etc. So thank you for that. I appreciate, and I see here request for you to please post your slides because they were really amazing. Now, turning to the rest of our participants on this broader question, I see there's more questions being asked, but before we proceed, maybe Vladimir, Emil, and Bedina, I can let you an opportunity to answer my question about the relative, basically strengthening of Russia and the balancing act of the countries of the region, trying to basically try to adjust to this new situation. Vladimir, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah. Okay. Very briefly then. Well, I think yes, it does empower Russia very much so. I mean, of course, we have to see what happens in the coming weeks and months. Of course, theoretically speaking, there is still possible a big turn, a huge shift by Trump administration in dealing with Russia. I don't personally expect such a turn, but there could be some shifts, some tactical nuances, employed in that respect. But yes, it does empower Russia. It does empower others around the globe who think that, well, the West, is, after all, hasn't finished the job. It hasn't finished the job of helping Ukraine, and the US is already AWOL and turning its back on Ukraine and generally on Europe. So basically, this is a big signal to a lot of people, not just to Russia, that US cannot be persistent enough with actually concluding whatever it started in helping Ukraine. And also that the West, if US is manipulated by Russia, then they can actually even subscribe to some narratives coming from Kremlin, like we've heard a number of things, including this insistence on elections in Ukraine during the martial law, on Zelensky being a dictator who is illegitimate, on other things, including Secretary Rubio saying that yes, US is involved in a proxy war against Russia, and many, many other things. And that's unfortunate. And that's, of course, it all emboldens Russia. And if Russia is delivered some results that it is seeking in the end of this war, then it will embolden them even more, and then they will be thinking that they have won and the West is weak, and that's the outcome that would the conclusion that would other people share as well around the globe, and that's unfortunate. And I don't think this is something that would benefit a lot of people outside of Russia. And finally, yes, Ukraine is adapting to US, changing its attitude, including by getting closer and cozier with Europe. It remains to be seen if Europe can actually be a reliable, coherent enough and determined player in that particular respect, and how quickly can the Europe get their act together. But still, it's almost basically like there's no choice for Ukraine. If it's not the US, then it's Europe. And that's something that Ukraine is now pursuing, and hopefully will get some results of this cooperation.
Just to add to the adaptation point, Vladimir, that I've seen yesterday that Ukraine announced plans to purchase $50 billion weapons deal from the United States. So
Right.
that's actually promising news that Ukraine has the money and it's seemingly adjusting to this new reality. Well, maybe that can be something that can work out, do you think?
Right, I think it could. And another question is whether Europeans can actually buy weapons from the US with their money and give it to Ukraine. Whether it would be okay with Trump, because on one hand, he would rather like the idea of selling something for the real money. But on the other hand, if he keeps this poster of a neutral, honest arbiter or referee on the war, then of course he might block it, knowing that the weapons are going to Ukraine. So we'll see about that, because if anything Europe has with all the economic slowdown, is money. Especially if they dare to touch Russian frozen assets down the road, which they might. I think the debate is still out there, but yeah. So that's a way forward to interest Americans, maybe with this purely transactionist approach.
Hope it works out. Thank you, Vladimir. Emil and Bedina, up to you. Emil, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, in terms of the pivot that we have seen, inconclusive though, of the Trump administration towards Russia, I think in general, the Central Asian countries were relatively comfortable for what it is worth. The question was primarily economic. All Central Asian countries have very serious economic, if not dependence, then a very great volume of trade and back and forth. And one potential outcome could be that the Russian economy collapses. I don't know how that would look like, but certainly any collapse on the Russian side would have a very serious damaging effect on the Central Asian economies as well. Or Russia collapses into some sort of a more than economic or political sort of a collapse and chaos that would be even more terrible in the imaginaries of Central Asian capitals. Now, that said, Central Asians definitely, while they cannot say it very openly or only have said it half openly, they certainly reject the territorial attack and the attack on the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. And they do see that as a real potential risk for themselves, especially Kazakhstan has seen that as a serious concern. Now, with the United States' own, at least rhetoric so far, hopefully it will stay as rhetoric regarding Greenland, for example, regarding Canada. I think certainly that sort of rhetoric has been normalizing what Russia has done towards Ukraine. And that has not been a very good thing for Central Asian countries. And therefore, I think it is worth noting that to the extent that they could say it, at least the Kazakh government and the Uzbek government have said it at an earlier point, at least, that they support the territorial integrity of Ukraine and they stand and they call on heeding to the international law on this matter. And I think that's what they stick with. But certainly a more belligerent, a more explosive, and more dramatic sort of outcome that would involve Russia tumbling down would be also a very bad outcome for Central Asian countries for very practical reasons.
Very important point. Thank you, Emil. And I see a zillion of questions to you. I'll be back to you in a moment. But before that, Bedin, I'd love to hear your opinion. Plus, I see there's a question that's related that is asking about the Georgia's regime openly pursuing Russification. To what extent do you think that's another side effect, basically, that we are seeing that's related to relative weakening of Russia and relative strengthening of Russia and relative weakening of the West in the region?
Yeah, thanks very much. Very quickly about the first question from you. So, well, I think generally the public opinion in Georgia about this, but also the general policy about this is shaped by two events. So the one is very strongly felt trauma from the Russia-Georgia war in 2008, and also the way how the West reacted to it is a kind of non-event, and therefore majority of Georgians have these feelings that they are on their own if something new happens. And no one is going to help. And the second one is Russia's ongoing war of aggression in Ukraine. And the outcome of this war will also probably determine more or less where the South Caucasus countries will be heading. Because if the US somehow imposes unjust peace on Ukraine, then South Caucasus states will find themselves probably in Russian sphere of influence, or will somehow try to appease Russia or bandwagon Russia. Because if the West can't help Ukraine, they certainly can't help those countries either, which are so less strong and less important to the West compared to Ukraine. Now about the Georgian Dream and its Russification policy. Well, as I said, I think Georgian Dream is not ideologically a pro-Russian force. They are getting closer to Russia and also not just to Russia, also to China, to Turkey, to Azerbaijan, to other powers that are authoritarian, to consolidate their power. So I think their main reason is domestic political, to consolidate their power, to establish some authoritarian systems that ensures their extended stay in power. And they know full well that they can't do it together with the West. and being close allies of the EU and the United States. For them, they need to be somehow in one basket with authoritarian states. I think that's the main agenda of them. Therefore, yeah, I mean, getting closer to Russia and implementing similar laws in Georgia, this is a byproduct of their major objective, which is, again, to consolidate their political power and to stay in power as long as possible. Theoretically speaking, if the West agrees to this kind of deals, that they engage with Georgia geopolitically, and I think geopolitical importance has also increased in the last years of Georgia, and they turn blind eye to human rights and democracy, Georgian Dream will be very happy to again get closer to the West, and they are not interested per se while they're getting closer to Russia. They're also not interested to be a puppet state of Russia, because then there will be another kind of coercion and another kind of conditionality. They don't want it. They want to play with everyone against everyone. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Abdin. So now I turn to questions from our participants, the rest of the audience, and I see a number of questions. Basically, I would aggregate them pertaining as to the great power, the multipolarity, the new multipolar reality. Specifically, Emil, probably this one's for you, but I would encourage the rest of our participants to answer if they are feeling comfortable. Regarding the Asian region, do you see the prominent Indo-Pacific stakeholders, allies like South Korea and Japan, playing a role in influencing the Indo-Pacific region or South Asia as a whole? And there's another question asking about perhaps a stronger role for Central Asia, creating a group towards Russia, China, and the EU, developing kind of multipolar strategy, Central Asia 5 plus India, like specifically the 5 states in Central Asia 5 plus EU, Central Asia plus Gulf states, perhaps basically trying to find its own place in this new, more turbulent and obviously changing world. How do you see this dynamic? Who are the interested stakeholders? Is it possible to see new alliances shaping that will be able to really kind of counterbalance the United States and Russia? And Emil, probably this one is for you, but I would, again, as I said, also encourage other participants to step in.
Yeah, I would definitely invite others to chime in on the broader sort of geopolitical shifts, or the shift in the array of key powers, especially in Asia. I'd say it is an interesting question. A couple of questions did raise this C5+1 or the C5 framework. The Central Asian 5 has an interesting phenomenon, because until quite recently, there was very low level of cooperation and agreement, consensus among the 5. Each country was more or less trying to carry on with its own, and 2 countries would join this, 3 countries join that. And so this overlaying multilateral commitments were not leaving much space for the 5 countries themselves to actually make a region among themselves. But more recently, the US platform for engaging these countries, the C5+1, is the original name for the United States platform. It started in 2015, following the Crimea annexation and the start of this essential war of Russia against Ukraine. And it has become much more important since the full-scale war started, with a variety of C5+1s being courted and hosted in multiple regions and countries in the world, and where we could see that as long as the main country.
Oops, I think Emil got frozen for a second there. Emil, would you mind repeating the last sentence? We lost you for a second. It got frozen.
Yeah, as long as we note for ourselves that there is interest in C5+1 among different major powers or medium powers, I think the interest has been primarily about geography and geopolitics, perhaps less economics. In economic terms, each country has been trying to carry on its own. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have been the primary courted countries, Turkmenistan behind them. but as 5 countries together has been a major attraction for geopolitics, connectivity, logistics, transport corridors, that sort of stuff. And that, I think, has been giving these countries as together a greater level of agency, a greater level of voice. And there is that understanding among the countries, among the 5 capitals. And to that extent, they have been indeed developing slowly, gradually, but developing a common voice, a common position on this. And so I think in that sense, we might say there is a great growing agency in these countries, among these countries. But in terms of the competing, I sat down and counted. I could count about 12 actually attempted and implemented C5 platforms, +1 platforms. And many of them are not so active. Many of them started very long ago and have not really been developing very much. But I will say that among the non-Western, there is Japan. Japan was actually the very first to launch its Central Asia plus Japan platform in 2004. There is South Korea, India, Pakistan, China, of course, everybody has already seen. So these countries have had these competing, well, not so frontally competing, but rival sort of Central Asia +1 platforms. Now, from the Central Asian perspective, I think all of these countries are important, but indeed remain secondary. China is by far the more important, and close by are the United States, Russia, and possibly the European Union. Now, there is Turkey, which has increased its greater attention and is likely to be increasingly more important player. It was already an important player, but more recently it has definitely built up serious muscle and influence. And Central Asian countries have been very close in cooperation with Turkey, setting up a separate organization of Turkic states. And so those would be some of the parameters in which the broader geopolitics have been evolving beyond US Central Asia relationships.
Thank you, Emil. That's very comprehensive, and I think really provides a nice overview of the situation in Central Asia. Bedina, maybe the same question, basically, and it's also as a follow-up to the previous question, maybe the role of other actors, maybe Turkey, Ukraine, in trying to change the status quo. Does the current situation sort of empowers them to play a broader role, I imagine, and perhaps counterbalance some of the negative trends that Russia represents in the region? And feel free certainly to pick up any other parts of the previous questions that I asked.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm more skeptical about this unfolding new multipolarity in the South Caucasus because yeah, I mean, we have a few global actors. China has been very active in economic and investments area, but they are not a player in terms of geopolitical and security engagement. And China, I think, considers South Caucasus as a sphere of Russian influence, and they would never compete with Russia in the South Caucasus. Other Asian powers, such as India, some East Asian countries, they are not really present geopolitically in the region. India, a little bit maybe, they started some military cooperation with Armenia, but not much. Now, regional actors, yes. I mean, Turkey has been always present in Georgia and with Azerbaijan. They have strategic agreement. Now trying to normalize relations with Armenia as well. But on the other hand, I mean, Turkish-Russian relations, the smaller South Caucasus countries, especially Georgia and Armenia, they have been always suspicious about relations between Turkey and Russia and two liberal powers and what they could do. And so far, Turkey and Russia they are more complicated partners, but they are not rivals in a way, and they have always find solutions to some complex issues such as the Nagorno-Karabakh wars that could have had negative impact on their bilateral relations. They somehow managed it so far. Now I think the overall there have been three major players in the South Caucasus. Those are Russia, United States, and the European Union. Now, if United States is going to leave, it will be Russia and the European Union. And I don't know to what extent you can manage on its own the geopolitical competition with Russia. And Turkey, I think Turkey will remain. Turkey is a very pragmatic actor. They would trade, and they would have deals with everyone, but at the same time they will try to not to engage extensively. And the other regional actors, I mean, Iran has been more passive in terms of geopolitics. They have their interests, of course, and some issues with Azerbaijan and Armenia, but they are not a key geopolitical actor in the South Caucasus. So it really comes down to three actors: United States, it's kind of leaving, European Union, and Russia.
So it's not bipolarity, tripolarity, but still limited to the same old actors. Thank you very much, Bedina. Maria, I have a question to you here from Adam Stolberg asking, do you believe that Russia's attitude, willingness to incur high material costs in war in Ukraine, readily extends to aggressive postures directed at Central Asia, South Caucasus, with the new Trump administration becoming more pragmatic, differential? In other words, if Trump more hands off and does not force neighboring states to choose Russia versus the West, will Russia be less inclined to intervene with heavy hand, basically perhaps less triggered, and or create, on the contrary, it will create more opportunities for pragmatic ties with the Central Asian Caucasus? Or on the contrary, the nationalist pressures a real constraint on a more moderated Russian approach? Basically, how does this convert into more assertive Russian nationalist posture vis-a-vis Central Asia? This one's for you, Maria, but again, as I said before, other participants, please feel free to raise your hands and jump in.
Yeah, it's a very big, complex question. I honestly, the simplest answer is that I don't think the level of importance that Russia has assigned to Central Asia has never gone in any comparison close to the levels of importance that Russia has placed on Ukraine. Historically, since 1990s, how much of an emphasis Russia has placed on Central Asia in its foreign policy kind of has waxed and waned. It kind of was elevated in importance following 2014. But I've always thought of Russia's attitude or foreign policy towards Central Asia as more like reactive rather than proactive, in some cases opportunistic, and kind of responding to something that was happening there, either in terms of heightened terrorist activity, sometimes concocted by the Kremlin itself, or in terms of the perceived encroachment on Russia's spheres of influence, so to say, by whomever, or the West's programs to democratize at some point Central Asian republics. So having said that, though, there has been, and plus Russia doesn't really have resources, financial or investments into the energy project that it would like to have to continue sustaining its presence in Central Asia. So having said that, though, and consistent with my argument that Russia's foreign policy to Central Asia has been a reaction to a response to some of the political, international, and economic exigencies of the day. We've seen when Russia was put under tremendous sanctions following its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it was forced to pivot to Asia. And Central Asia all of a sudden was raised in significance as part of the International North-South Transport Corridor, INSTC, which is it's a confluence of transportation networks, and it's envisioned as a way of connecting Moscow, St. Petersburg through Iran to Central Asia, to India. Okay, and in this geopolitical, geoeconomic imagery, both North Caucasus and Central Asia play a greater or lesser role. Why it matters? Again, it is a response to change in geoeconomics following its invasion of Ukraine. Two, it is consistent what the far right ultranationalists envision, again, like the great Russia, because it's part of Russia's geopolitical posture. But having said that, the only kind of claimer that I see a lot on those kind of ultra-nationalist, ultra-patriots channels is the heavy criticism of the Kremlin's policy towards migrants. So as long as the Kremlin is able to separate the immigrant issue, which is domestic, from its pursuit of this its pursuit of this broader Eurasianist vision of Russia through that network of transport passages, some of which run through Central Asia. I think that is not going to constitute, that's going to sit well with some of those ultra patriots. But with all of that, this is, again, in terms of the salience, Central Asia is nowhere in the picture. In terms of the salience, Gaza, Israel, almost nowhere in the picture. Interestingly enough, even Iran and China and their relations with the United States, they were present in the broader info system before January. They're still there, but they're those types of issues are superseded by everything else that is going on. Like, a lot of emphasis has shifted in the past 2-3 months. So, great questions, but again, on the broader scheme of things, they kind of seem to be really inconsequential at this particular moment to the Kremlin and to the majority of the Russians based on public opinion polls.
Thank you very much. Very comprehensive, Maria. Anybody perhaps if would like to jump in? I know, Bedina, maybe you have a take. On our side, we're tracking the Russian military capabilities to becoming more aggressive. And general conclusion that potentially, if it really wanted to, unfortunately, even now, it can pull off another 2008 style campaign against Georgia if it's limited. Even if it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, but it's not unfeasible, even despite how stretched and damaged it is in Ukraine at the moment. So unfortunately, there are still always reasons to be wary about Russia's new imperialist posture. If there's no alternative other comments, I will ask the question that's repeated in chat, and that one is about the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Apparently, we've heard some a sort of posture on the side of the U.S. administration regarding wanting to claim back the base from the base that's currently controlled by China. Who has to be worried in this scenario? How feasible it is? Shall we be worried at all? Emil, this one's probably for you as well, but again, I welcome other contributions.
Yeah, one on Bagram Air Base. In Central Asia, there is rather little information exactly what's going on in Afghanistan, and more than that, or contrary to this claim from Mr. Trump, there is widespread perception in Central Asia that although the United States has left Afghanistan, they still are very much in contact with the Taliban, and they are working with Taliban on various projects, such as, for example, the very controversial water canal called Kosh-Tepa on Amu Darya, which is essentially the natural borderline between several Central Asian countries and Afghanistan. And the rumor has it in Central Asia that the United States is behind that project, all the way to sponsoring it. Now, there is some truth to that, because that was in the books and in discussions before the US withdrawal, but the actual implementation, as far as we've seen, is entirely Taliban. And as for Bagram, the Taliban themselves have resolutely rejected any such claim that it is under Chinese control. Some other competing claims have put it that actually the United States is quite present there in non-public presences and visits. So I have certain doubts, and sometimes I feel like certain communications from the Trump administration come out more with the motivation of biting Biden back rather than being very accurate on the facts.
I think Vladimir's comment also somewhat suggested that conclusion. I want to be cognizant of the time. We have about 8 minutes left, and I would like to ask you, all of you, one more question, to which feel free to incorporate perhaps answers to some of the remaining questions in chat, which we did not have an opportunity to address. Specifically, when it comes to our region, Eurasia broadly understood, which world do you think we still live in it? Is it a multipolar world? Is it maybe a tripolar world, right? Factoring in the EU, Russia, the United States. By the way, the puzzling, there wasn't as many questions about the role of China in chat, and I just wanted to flag that it was actually interesting to me. Or is it some other world that we live in? Do you see basically that something, some radical realignment of geopolitical alliances is taking place, or it's more or less the same old reality, perhaps with some adjustments, turbulence, but not much of a difference? Well, maybe we go backwards. Bedina, maybe you would like to start.
Sure, thanks. Well, there is also this concept of multiplexity, which means that in different policy areas, you could have different constellations. And I think this also applies to Eurasian region when it comes to when we take South Caucasus, for instance, and in economic area, there are it's a multipolar world, and there are many both regional and global actors involved, including China, China is becoming more and more active by year, and they are on the path to become the key trade and investment partner, or at least trade partner for all South Caucasus states. There are also some regional actors. Turkey is a very important player. Russia, EU, and many others. When it comes to, again, geopolitics and security, the key actors that are present there are much fewer. And China is not an important actor when it comes to security and geopolitics. As I said before, it's just it's old constellations that persists. Russia, EU to some extent, Turkey, and United States. When it comes to political processes and values, it's clearly becoming more an illiberal world, illiberal and authoritarian world. We clearly have democratic backlash in the South Caucasus, but also I think in the broader Eurasian area. And sort of authoritarian diffusion of authoritarian norms and practices. And also neighborhood does matter, right? So Georgia also finds itself in an authoritarian neighborhood, and the same applies to Armenia, by the way, which now followed Georgia in its footsteps. It's more democratizing first and now applied for the EU membership, but if Georgia is a closed case in terms of turning illiberal and turning against the EU, then it will be also very difficult for Armenia to go closer to Europe and to be more democratic. So we clearly have this illiberal / authoritarian pattern and diffusion of liberal norms in the Caucasus and beyond.
More of the same, but definitely less pleasant, in other words. Thank you. Emil, please.
Yeah, I think we see a world in flux, a world on the move, not quite has arrived anywhere to any new polarity. I think there are multiple poles, wannabe poles, but there is no streamlined and stabilized polarity to the world. And I was recently having a similar conversation. I suggested maybe rather than multipolar, we're having a multivocal world. We have lots of voices with lots of topics, maybe something similar to multiplexity. And we have yet to settle down on something more stable that would organize the world and provide for a new world order. I think we are in a process of this world disorder, a process that is of disordering of the world, with certain costs to it. And switching to Central Asia, to C5, there were a couple of questions. I think Central Asian fives, in a way, are trying to react to this world in flux. They want to at least be able to resist some of the challenges that might arise because of this multivocality of different actors coming to Central Asia with different challenges. And Central Asian five are yet very far from anything like ASEAN or other sort of institutionalized organization, but eventually, as very predictably, as with any such multilateral cooperation platform, such eventual unification is not off the agenda. And indeed, in early 90s, there was such an ambition that was well premature and stopped was a stillborn idea. But I think eventually that can be, but probably not anytime very soon. And in terms of whether it can include the countries on the other side of the Caspian, well, Azerbaijan has been very active in building up dialogue with Central Asian countries. And as far as connectivity and pipeline topics are concerned, Georgia has also been part of that picture. But so far, yeah, the C5 themselves have been a rather loose group, which one of the commentators well noted. For example, Turkmenistan is very cautious in committing to anything. But I think the region is quite happy that at least they do attend. So yeah, I think be that in Central Asia, but especially around the world, we do have this a very destabilized situation that hasn't really come to a new order, and hopefully it comes there sooner than later.
Just a reminder, word of caution that it sometimes take a world war to arrive to a new world order. I hope we get there smoother, even if, of course, the Ukrainian war is already highly
Yeah, I think that
atrocious.
war is already enough, and hopefully it will end sooner than
With the
many
victory
people
of Ukraine. Vladimir, with that, the floor is yours.
Right, thanks. Well, I actually agree with the previous speakers, including Emil. I think that we don't know what's going to happen. I think it's shifting. I think the situation is very fluid. I think the polarity might be shifting, and you know, it's not only about China or only about Russia. It's also about U.S. What would happen to the U.S. and their influence on the world? You know, they're continuously shooting themselves in a foot, it seems, and then you know, but that might actually lead to major unraveling of traditional alliances and you know, rupture in relations with many countries that used to be very important to be on the U.S. side. And can U.S. actually go it alone? I don't think so. I mean, that's naive assumption that they can still do a lot. But one major inflection point is still the war of Russia against Ukraine, and it still matters how it ends, when it ends, and will Russia get with a lot of loot or just a little bit of it? You know, or will they actually be appearing or emerging somewhat victorious, or not necessarily? You know, this is going to be very important for around the world, but definitely in the post-Soviet world, because I remember from 22. When we were kind of a bit euphoric, and that wasn't called for, as we understand now in the retrospective view, when Ukraine was fighting back and liberating some territory. But around the post-Soviet space, we also saw Moldova, which was emboldened. We saw hope for Belarus maybe becoming free at some point in Central Asia. I remember that meeting, the video. I would never unremember it when some local leaders were kind of, you know, talking on an elevated tone to Putin and wagging their finger and demanding respect for their, you know, national culture and everything, because that was looking like Russia is on the back of their heels, you know. And ever since, unfortunately, Russia recuperated. They recovered a lot of their influence. They're still wounded, but there have been many examples in all of those places, including Moldova, for instance, where Russia messed up greatly with the elections and everything. That Russian bear is probably wounded, but not mortally. You know, it had a major punch in the face, but it kind of recovered from it. So it's time to finish the job, for the sake of not just Ukraine, but for the sake of the post-Soviet Eurasia, European security, or Euro-Atlantic security, what have you.
And we hope that Ukraine will have to do all this dirty job by itself, with hopefully help of allies. Thank you, Vladimir. Maria.
Yeah, thank you. So my take is both similar and different take on the question, which world do we live in? I think we live in the world where a country that has presented itself as the leader of the world, one of the most influential countries in the world, the United States, has increasingly adopted the views on the world espoused by its adversaries, Russia and China. And I'm saying that because I'm alarmed to hear how frequently multipolarity is used in the policy discourse in the United States. This is the view that is stripped of the thick rule-based, right-based communities, that emphasizes brute and crude force, that doesn't recognize the agency of the smaller and medium powers. So having said that, I do believe that the countries that are espousing these views, they are really removed from a much more complex reality. So I do agree with everything that my predecessor said in terms of the reality does not match that very narrowly construed, rigid, kind of realist worldview, right? That the reality, is better be used with terms like multiplexity or strategic multi-alignment and similar terms, lots of uncertainty, lots of fluidity. And so for me, it would be interesting to see how this reality that is, by the way, shared by many in Eurasia, except for Russia, of strategic multi-alignment opportunities, how those views and practices meet this much more rigid multipolar vision that I think is increasingly shared by the United States, Russia, and China. So this is something that I will be watching how it's going to play out.
Thank you so much, Maria, and our dear participants. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today. Clearly, there's a lot to discuss, and while it's sobering to watch, it's also certainly extremely fascinating analytically, if it's any. I know it's a bad consolation, but it is a consolation. I thank Pourners for helping us organize this fascinating conversation, and David Zacconi in particular for initiating the conference. And please sign up and follow all the great events that Pourners organizes, including a conference devoted to the same topics later next week. And please stay tuned for more. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.